Hello again. Welcome to Marketing Cafe Live. We are here in another session that we do once a week here in the Marketing Cafe. And today we're going to talk about a really important topic. It's branding. And not only is it a really important topic, it's a very misunderstood topic. And so we're going to talk about the secret side of branding, the side that a lot of people don't know about, don't realize. And we're going to be talking with someone who's really an expert, really focuses in on this idea of branding. And this gentleman is brilliant graphic designer, but much more than that. He really dives into the full marketing aspects of branding. Well, I'm Michael K. Reynolds, and I own a marketing agency for many years called Global Studio. You can learn all about me at globalstudio.com. And let's get on with our talk of branding with Alejandro. Alejandro, welcome to Marketing Cafe Live.
Hey, Michael, I'm so glad to be here. Thank you very much.
All right. So before we get rolling here, Alejandro, let's let folks know kind of what it is that you do. Let's talk a little bit about after they listen to you speak, they're going to be mesmerized. They're going to be super impressed. And then they're going to want to know, gosh, how can I work with Alejandro? So, what is it that you do? And first of all, let folks know where you're broadcasting from.
Thank you very much. So, my name is Alejandro. I'm broadcasting from Costa Rica right now. From here. And so, I'm a brand identity designer. I'm the founder of Center Studio, which you can see the address over there. Well, over there.
And just so you know, we had a big branding graphics battle because I wanted to do center and studio uppercase because from a marketing standpoint of legibility, it's much more memorable. And Alejandro was just flabbergasted and said, "No, it's got to be all lowercase." So this is how our day started rolling. This is how it is when I work with graphic artists. All my times in a marketing agency.
Yeah, to me, it's all about the consistency of how I see it. But hey, I'm super excited to be here. And I think this is a very interesting topic that I see that I think there is a couple of things that I can like give to the community. I'm very excited to be here.
So tell us about your business and what precisely you do and how you help people.
Yeah, so I'm a brand identity designer. So what I do is that, for instance, when a business needs to launch and then they need, kind of a brand identity, an image, let's see, the logos, the secondary graphics, and all that. Well, I take care of that. And also sometimes we figure out that what we need is actually take a step back and help people with the brand strategy so that their visual identity is a clear reflection of, a clear strategy. So that's what I do. And after that, I give some advice on how you can actually apply that visual strategy to marketing.
All right. Well, that's great. We're going to go ahead and dive into our topic here today, which is the secret side of branding. On Clubhouse, Alejandro is one of our baristas on Clubhouse, and we have these deep conversations about what is branding, how does branding work, how is it misunderstood. So that's kind of what we're going to cover. We're
Mhm.
going to be doing basically the fundamentals of really understanding what branding is. I think people have a lot of confusion about what branding is, what it does, and those kinds of things. And hopefully, through this session here today, we're going to get it all cleared up. So, Alejandro, you wanted to start with, in discussions of the secret side of branding, you wanted to start with, well, what is a brand?
Yeah, yeah. First of all, I think that it's important to start with that because, um, like one of the things that want to talk about a lot is what is branding and what is that triggered side. But if we don't understand first of all what is branding, then we're not going to get too far. So before we say the typical phrase of Martin Neumeyer that it is the gut feeling that you have about a product service, then we have to take a step back and remember where it all started, which is with the Egyptians marking cattle to kind of affirm their authority or their ownership of that cattle. And that's how it all started. Actually, the word brand comes from the Scandinavian brander, which means to burn. So that's how brands have been used throughout the history. But like, how did that word transition from being used to even in the Middle Age, they were used to torture and stuff like that. How that word transition to what we have today, and it's very interesting because this happened with the Industrial Revolution. All of a sudden, with all this overload offer of different products, then people had a lot of more choices. So marketers start to take advantage of different technologies that were available, such as newspapers, magazines, then the radio and all this, to promote their products. But all of a sudden, everything became noise. Everybody were like advertising the same products. So what they started doing was, how do we um, can stick out, and they start using colors, different fonts, different. But then it's like everybody started doing the same, and so they start actually studying the consumers and understand how they take their decisions, how is it that they purchase things, and they discover something very interesting. The emotions was actually a big driver. So they discovered that people didn't buy rationally, they buy emotionally, and then they justify their purchases like logically. And that's a big part of it. So what they also discover is that sometimes, like, or most of the times, people make purchases based on who they want to be, for instance, their basic needs. And this is very true. Like nowadays, if you see the website, let's say, of Apple, you can see how they are selling their new MacBook Pros, and the way that they put it is like, well, a good machine for the pros, something like that. So what they're trying to do is send you this message, like, if your identity is that you are a professional, then you should buy this thing. So they're appealing to your emotions now. So what they understood was that the brand was not only a logo, there was not only colors, it was not only all these things. It was actually emotional impressions that you leave on people's mind, intentionally or not. And that's actually my my definition of it, because sometimes people, they're not aware that uh, if, by them not doing branding, they're doing branding. So you're always leaving these impressions on people's mind. So that's kind of my take on one
Yeah, and
line.
I think what you said that's really important is that there's an evolution of the brand, and then the brand kind of really changed, and it really comes back to competitiveness. So if we start at the beginning of advertising, it was basically, I have this bottle of material and it's going to work, and it's going to cost you 5 cents. And then advertising started to evolve into really talking about benefits of it, not just what is it, but benefits. And that's
Hmm.
because it got more competitive. And this was in the late 20s when you started getting mass advertising in radio and in print. And what happens is things that work in the beginning stop working. And so marketers keep innovating. And then you get to the period of where you can't not only just say, this is what we do, but this is what we do differently. So the whole difference and differentiation was
Hmm.
another element of it. And then it got to a point that even that wasn't enough, to where
Hmm.
let's go deeper into the psyche of the actual consumer, and that we're actually talking about their emotions and the way they feel. But the key with all of this, with branding, and I think is so important, is that branding is what exists on your consumer's side of things. That's how they feel about your product. That's how
Hmm.
they think about your product. And this is often a struggle, I think, with my inventors, my engineers, is because they have this belief, if they just make this incredible, fascinating thing that is going to be amazing, that people will just figure it out and they'll just come running to it. And that doesn't happen. And the reason is because people have such a small attention set with all of this.
Hmm.
And and I call it marketing at 70 miles an hour. It's basically, you get that billboard while they're driving 70 miles an hour, and that impression that they have for the first time is the first part of that experience. And then that evolution of that brand, as you said, it becomes something that is embedded in their psyche. And is that something that they want to keep? Is that something that they are developing a relationship? So in many ways, that brand is what exists within the sphere of your customers and your prospects. And that's why it's really so challenging to manage that, because you can totally manage how many screws and how many, how much you polish the
Yeah.
stainless steel of your object. But getting into that world to where you're really trying to, remote control work and create that experience remotely, it's pretty high level.
Yeah, and you know what? Like now that you were talking about that, I can think of an example of that, which is Coca-Cola, and they did this very well, and they were there since the beginning, of the Industrial Revolution and all this, and they started, advertising their product, as a very refreshing beverage, and then, um, fast forward to today, you see their ads saying drink happiness. And you see like a happy woman, with all the breeze in their hair, like then drinking that Coca-Cola. So what they're doing there is actually sending an emotional message that you can identify with. And that's the key. I think if businesses want to be successful, they need to understand first their consumers and their emotions, and make like an empathy map of how they see the world, how they perceive the world, so that then they start creating a brand that actually can connect with our audience. And I think that you said something very important, which is the brand lives within the mind of the consumers. It's not something that lives within, your computer or your file or your plans or anything. However, you can be very strategic so that you can influence that perception. So for instance, it's like you cannot control people, but you can influence people, and you can be very strategic about it. And I remember when I was in Amazon, I worked at Amazon for 7 years, and for the leadership team, they had this saying that, or one of their pillars is you need to develop your leadership brand. And one of the things that you had to do is, okay, so ask yourself, how do you want to be perceived? What is the kind of image that you want to leave on people's mind when you're not in the room? And so that's super important, that you have the power to influence that perception. But know that if you are not doing anything to influence that perception, they're going to still have a brand of you. They're going to still have a perception of you.
Yeah, and it's interesting you brought the Coca-Cola up, and I love the tie into leadership too as well, is that there's always been a core of kind of that happiness, so that feeling refreshed from the very early days of actually they were saying this is going to change your mood in a positive way. And of course, the very early days, it had elements of cocaine in it, so it had some actually scientific rationale for it. But even if you look at the 70s, right, where they were doing advertisements, I like to teach the world to sing. It was about happiness, but
Mhm.
kind of from, the 60s, 70s version, to where you have drink happiness now, which is more of the current culture. And then, they're already dabbling into the metaverse and starting to own happiness within the metaverse. So it's still keeping consistent to what that
Yeah.
core is, making adjustments as you go along. And that's what's so fascinating about a brand. All right. So that is what is a brand. So this is a real subtle shift here. What is branding?
So I think that, when I started writing about, and you can find in my website a couple of articles that I did in these terms. But I like to challenge this type of, basic concepts, because what I found is that we assume that we are all on the same page, but when we you start doing some kind of research, you realize that we're not. Like we're all having like different terms. So, and this can be very confusing for a lot of entrepreneurs. And so let me give you an example. If you search in YouTube, like, the second best search engine in the world, what is branding? You're going to get a video of an interview, with one of the authorities in branding, which is Marty Neumeyer. And 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 Chris Doe is actually interviewing him, and he asked him this question. I think you're one of the best persons to answer to this question. So what is branding? And he started answering that question by saying, okay, first let me tell you what a brand is not. And he said, well, a brand is not a logo, a brand is not the typography, a brand is not the colors, a brand is blah blah. And then that's what he said, a brand is actually the result of all that. A brand is, customers got feeling of a product, of a service, and all this. And I'm like, wait a minute, let me rewind. And I like rewind the video and I say, this is weird, because Christo asked him, what is branding? And what he replied with is, what is a brand? So you actually keep looking, watching the video, and and they start using those two terms interchangeably. And keep in mind, of course, English is not my first language, and so I went kind of a dictionary and all these things, and I say, okay, maybe there is a gap here in my knowledge as to, maybe for instance, like the word painting. You can use painting to the act of paint, but also to describe, the result of that action. And I went to Merriam-Webster's, and no, like branding and brand are like way two different things. And to put it in simple terms, the brand is, as Neumeyer said, is the result. But then branding is the process. It's the process by which you get that result. So I think the difference is very important. And you can think in a way of like, oh, we're just getting into semantics here. But no, I think if you just think that branding is just the brand, then you're missing a lot. Because then, if branding is the process, a good question to ask yourself is, okay, so where does that process begin? And I think that if we have to say the secret side of branding, I would say is the beginning. Where does it all begin? Like, and it's very interesting, because to answer that question, you can use the example of tattooing, and I think it's very appropriate, because you're leaving a permanent brand, a permanent mark, in this case in your skin. And then, the tattoo, you cannot say that it's the same as tattooing. It's not. So the tattooing is the process by which you get a tattoo. But then ask yourself, where does that process begins? It doesn't begin when the ink start, getting into your skin. That doesn't start there. It starts with when, the guy that is, or the girl that is going to get that tattoo says, I want a tattoo. And it starts, ideating that tattoo and saying, hey, I would like to have that on my skin. I would like to, I don't know, remember this or have that or whatever. And then this person goes to the professional in tattoos, hopefully, and then and then that person starts saying, okay, tell me more about it. What is your idea? And then start, kind of putting together a design, and then goes into the skin, and then they're start putting ink to it. It's a whole process.
It's really important what you're saying and underscoring is the difference of the brand is really what your brand is, how it exists in the mind of your prospects and customers in that slice of time. So your brand 6 months prior, 1 year prior, 4 seconds prior changes and shifts, but that's actually how it exists. And so this is why it's so important. And I think what you're bringing out and we're underscoring the secret side of it is that people think that branding is just something they got to get done. All right, so I got to open an office space. I've got to order electricity. I got to do this. I got to get my branding done, and then I got to move. It's just another thing. Whereas branding is what you do when you start your idea at the very beginning to when you finally surrender it or it becomes forgotten in the last mind. And so a brand can actually exist well beyond the founder, well beyond the company. And it's also key to understand that you are constantly branding. And this is the hardest thing is you can do an absolutely beautiful logo. The colors are exquisite. They're perfectly balanced. The design is amazing. And for years, that brand in people's heads triggers happiness, triggers confidence, triggers you slip up, you do something wrong, or you do something counter to the brand. And that's why this element of brand confusion, where why did you get involved in that? That has nothing to do with your branding. Why? when I come to your service or when I use your product, I feel like this, and I count on feeling like this, and this is my place, my happy place that I go to. And then you brought this in here. Why did you do that? And that's why your customers and your prospects, they can get angry if you mess with
Mhm.
their brand, because it exists within themselves. And when you're doing really well, they're owning your brand in a very positive way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And like I would say you said something very important, which is that the brand can even exist after the business is gone. Well, see blockbusters. Like
Yeah.
they they're such a great example because almost everybody knows what blockbusters is. And and maybe is used a lot for examples of, when people they don't want to evolve and progress, and then comes Netflix and eat their lunch and all these things. But it's very important to know that.
Well, before you move on, because I think that it's really a great example, because I happened to be around when Blockbusters was really a big deal. But Blockbusters used to mean, the brand used to mean a date. It used to mean family time. It used to
Yeah.
mean, I mean, think of how much we do, Netflix and HBO and stream now. Well, that was it. For me, it meant walking around the aisles for an hour because I couldn't make up my mind on what movies I wanted to see. But it was like an infinite amount of possibilities, and it was really well lit, and people were coming in, and it was almost like a movie theater. You had candy that you would buy right before you went in. But it was all these people they weren't just coming to get a movie, but this was part of their weekend plan. So it was kind of a gathering almost of people that really were excited about getting to make a movie experience special. And then as you fast forward, that brand, and the business hasn't done anything on that brand for years and years, but it's evolved now to a phonograph needle or something obsolete. And even with the phonograph needle used to represent obsolete, and then it came back in popularity when people wanted vinyl albums. But it's just an example of, you can kind of adjust the brand, but anytime you think you're fully in control is when you get
Yeah.
in trouble. But this is where the influencing part that you talked about, that's where the artistry, the mastery of it is so important. So let's go to our final section here, which is, what does branding involve? What comprises that process, as you talked about? So you mentioned there's brand is where you arrive
Hmm.
at that very moment. Branding is the process. It's kind of like walk and walking. I went
Hmm.
on a walk, but I'm currently walking. So, that kind of same aspect. So let's talk about, what
Yeah.
does branding involve?
Yeah. So, like back to that question, like if you understand, so now what branding really is, and if you understand the power that you can have, you can influence your brand, then it is a good question to ask yourself, okay, so when does branding begins? And there's a famous author that is called Andy Stallman. Funny enough, he's not he's from Argentina, I guess. So he's very unknown in in the English like area or whatever. But in Spanish, he's like the new Martin, the new Martin Meyer. And what he says is that branding is the process of creation, development, and construction of brands. And that's when I started, to ask myself, oh, okay, so it's interesting. So where actually the branding begins, and it begins with the planning. When you have that idea, that business idea, the next thing that you want to do is take it to a business plan. And one of the things that people recommend is, okay, so maybe don't overthink it that much. Maybe don't spend too much time in the planning phase. But then there is these tools like the planning canvas and all these things that helps you to kind of put together an idea and see if it is profitable. Um, but then one thing that is very important about planning, because I would say there is three pillars, and I would love to hear if you agree with that. The planning phase So to me, a business has two phases, basically. The first phase is the planning phase, and the other one is the execution. And so the planning phase to me has three pillars, which is the business plan, and then the brand strategy, and the marketing strategy. So those to me are the three pillars that I have noticed of a business. And so what do you think of that? Would you agree? Would you add that? Or would you like change it?
I think that's funny because that's coming from a marketing professional, because I think that probably, a lot of entrepreneurs would say there's the planning phase, there's the financial design phase, there's the manufacturing design. But, you and I were marketing, and so you kind of
Yeah.
introduced it as three. But the truth of the matter is marketing is so important because, one of my definitions for it is, that's how you succeed in business. You can create the greatest restaurant in the world. You can have master chefs. You can have a maitre d' who is well beloved. You can have a great staff, and it can be designed well. But
Mhm.
if you don't have the marketing to bring people to introduce it to the restaurant, you have an empty, sad restaurant. And
Yeah.
so marketing is really key to that. So I would say I totally agree about it from a marketing perspective.
Yeah, and I would say that in the business plan, I would include everything that has to do, with the success of the business itself. Too, I would say that the purpose of a business plan is making sure that you have a clear plan to make it like profitable. At the end of the day, that's what it is. And then with the purpose of a brand strategy is to make sure that you have a clear plan to connect with the audience, to know. So that entails knowing first of all who you are as a brand, because you don't want to be fake. You want to be authentic and everything. So highlight your strengths, understand where are your weaknesses, and like what is your position in the market, for instance, and all these things. Like understand who you are, and then understand your audience, understand your market, and then try to find like make a strategy on how to connect with that people. That is super key. And then to be marketing, and that's a thing that I don't touch too much, and I'm not an expert on that. But to me, is the purpose of a marketing strategy is to have a clear big picture plan on how are we going to then take that brand and make it known so that people can buy from the brand. Is that something that you would agree that a brand strategy, marketing strategy does?
Yeah, here's what I would add to what you said, and the
Mhm.
elements are spot on, is that much like there's brand and branding, is that planning is something that never ceases in a business. And so
Yeah,
you have a plan, and then you're constantly planning and you're constantly adjusting.
yeah,
What I do believe is that, and that's why everyone involved in a business and an organization kind of has different goals and objectives. I love working with founders, with entrepreneurs, and I
hmm,
coach them on what's your island, what's your goal, what's your destination. If
hmm,
everything was absolutely working perfect with this organization, and not just, oh, we're making a profit, it's personally, I have time on the weekend, I'm able to see my kids'
yeah,
games, I'm able to do all that stuff. So I actually think the goal, the island is pretty fixed, but the plan and the marketing strategy is constantly shifting because we're dealing with winds. And so
yeah,
there's no such thing as a power boat where there's the island, we're going to go to it. You're constantly having to tack. And so even with your marketing strategy, it's very similar as well.
hmm,
Is when the wind is at 30 miles an hour, your strategy is much different than when it's at 2 miles
yeah,
an hour. And so, but yeah, I totally agree with that. But when people come to you and they say, "Hey, I'm started my business," and you mention it, they say, "I need a logo," and then you kind of walk them through a process of understanding they actually need a lot more.
yeah. And you would ask yourself like, what does planning and all this has to do with branding? And the reason which I bring it up is that at each point you need to have in mind what is the image that people wants to have, of your brand. So in the let's say in the business plan, you, what prices are you going to have, like, are you going to make a big factory, or are you going to make like a small store, or all these things, all these decisions, if you don't make them with the with a clear or with the best clear picture of what is the brand that you want to project, then you might have to change a lot of things once you get to brand strategy. So to answer more your question, is like when people come to me and say, hey, I just need a logo, for instance, like this recently there's a radio station from Canada that reached out to me and said, hey, I need a logo. So we had a meeting, and we meet with the there's like a big network of radios, and we meet with a lot of people there, and they that was their initial like question. Okay, we need a logo. But then when I start asking, okay, so tell me more about it, what do you need? And so the big problem that they had is that the current the whole branding, the whole like visual identity that they are being using, it feels outdated, it feels old, it feels like they're, from the past. And of course they want to, refresh their image, they want to be current with the times and all these things. And also there is a lot of inconsistency in the way that their brand is being used. So in the website is used one way with some colors, with some logos and whatever, and in social media it's used in a whole different way. So you see the website and their social media, and you think there's like two different companies. So there's a lot of inconsistency there. And so when when you have in mind, hey, I just need a logo, you can even like discover, oh, so my problem is that my visual identity, which is what people call branding, is not consistent. So it entails more than a logo. It's like, okay, so let's check the colors, let's check the typography, let's check the use of different secondary graphics. People don't think about these things, but when you use your social media, you need to be consistent in the way to use secondary graphics. And by secondary graphics, what I mean is, like when you put a text, like you can make like a little box to contain it. Okay, that needs to be consistent throughout all your ads, so that the next time that people see an ad from you, or a post from a social media, whatever, they see, oh, that is that brand immediately. That's the power of visual identity. It can evoke a brand immediately, but if you're not consistent with it, you're not gonna get that result.
Yeah, and again, you speak from the perspective of a designer, and it's so important because I remember, we would have a company come to us and say, "Hey, we want to go through a branding exercise," and
Mhm.
and we do logos, we do colors, we do treatments and brochures and all different kinds of things. And I would do a lot of high level kind of marketing strategy in how we're aligning these, how we're designing these, give the creative brief to the team. I would put together copy. I would be so proud of the copy and the words and stuff. And then,
Mhm.
the group would come in their suits and stuff. We'd pull out all the boards. They didn't care about my copy. They didn't care about my strategy or anything like that. They're, oh, I really like that design. And so, for one thing, I could get self-conscious, like, what? My words don't matter. What's the problem? My strategy doesn't matter. But understanding the power of design is that's what people can see, and they pull so much from that. But getting back to the branding exercise, which is, it's so important, this radio station coming to you and saying, hey, we need to freshen things up. And you always have to really ask the strategic question of why. For instance, if the radio station was doing classic rock, they don't
Mhm.
want a progressive logo. So the idea that we want everything that's really now and here, you really have to think through
Yeah.
is what is the impression? What are the images? What are the things that are driving it? But probably the number one issue I would have with companies, and they would consistently struggle in this area, that basically have been around for 3, 5, 10 years, and almost 100% of the time they'd come in and I'd say, show me all of your marketing materials, and individually
Mhm.
they did okay. They look pretty good, but when you fan them out, they look like 8 different companies. There's no
Yeah.
consistency and there's no design. And this comes back to an idea of called the red dot. And the red dot is understanding that people don't care about us that much because they're so busy with what they're doing. There's a lot of choices. Now we care about ourselves as the company, and we think everybody, like 100% of the population, should know that we're the best choice. but people don't care about us that much because there's just too much out there, which means you have to have a really tight brand. You have to have a really consistent message. And so the example I give is that if you're in a room and you pull out a flashlight, or if it's in daylight and you put it up against the wall, no one's going to see that light because and that's all of the competition, it's all the noise. However, if you take a red dot from a laser, you can see that at any time of the day. So that's that red dot that your brand is pulling into the super powerful red dot, and it really matters, your design. And
Yeah.
so when people are communicating to you, they're saying, I just need a logo. What they're actually saying is, I don't want this to cost very much. But here's the thing, if you do not do this right, if you do not get your branding right at the core, at the beginning of the journey, it will cost you so much with inefficiency. Your radio will be inefficient, your TV will be inefficient, your social media will be inefficient. And
Yeah.
so probably one of the best investments you can do, and you don't need to hire a big fancy agency and spend 25,000 to 100,000 on branding unless you've got $1 billion budget. But if you get someone who's talented and good, and they really start you off with a really good brand that's tied into strategy, it will be one of the best investments that you make. And then also, it's fun. I mean, when you got a great logo, we were talking about promotional items, and your mugs look great, your shirts look great. Exactly. It all looks great. And so this initial design element, which is your world coming from the design element, but make sure that the strategy is underneath that. And that's why having someone like Alejandro, who's going to ask you the questions, why are you doing this, what is it that we
Yeah.
want to do, is so important. So again, you can find Alejandro by going to centerstudio.com. Keep in mind that it's lowercase c, lowercase s on there. And now here's the beautiful thing, is that if at any point you missed any of the brilliance of what Alejandro shared, and or maybe you heard it and now you want to rewind it and do it again, we have the Marketing Cafe Academy. So all of these lives go into the Marketing Cafe Academy and they're available for you. And here's the great news, it's totally free. And so brilliant people like Alejandro share in these training videos. So you go to marketingcafe.club, you'll see the link there to get to the Marketing Cafe Academy, and we've got all kinds of training in there. Again, it's totally for free. Any last thoughts, Alejandro, on the secret side of branding?
I would say that just think about when you need a logo and when you don't need a logo, when you need to refresh your branding and when you don't. That's really important because it's very tempting for people like us, like designers, to say no, 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 change everything. But you need to be very strategic about it. So I think that one of the things that I focus a lot, and not just being a designer and knowing about colors and all these things, but knowing about the business side of it, the strategic side of it, so that we can give like sound advice to the different people that are different. Not everybody needs like to refresh their logo. So when I talk this case of the radio, one of the problems is that their logo, for instance, is not flexible enough. So it is not like good to be used in different applications, because if you make it smaller, it disappears. So this is kind of science that tells you I need to refresh my brand because it's not flexible enough for today's times, where your logo is going to appear in very tiny screens of the phones. So those kind of signs, but also to keep in mind the brand equity that you have been building along the time. That's very important. Sometimes I see that, for instance, the case of Udemy, there's a very known like online academy, and they just took away all their colors, all their branding, and now they just seem like a new school. And those are things that we need to be careful about you know knowing that in there you have been building a brand in the minds of people. And when you want to do a rebranding, you want to take that into consideration, so you don't go too far and end up damaging your brand. So those are things that I would advise people when they are considering if you need a logo or not. And yeah, I'm really happy to be here, Michael. I remember when I um was, like scrolling through the clubhouse, and I see your club. I was just impressed by how good host you are there, and the good environment that you have. I just was like glued, and so thank you very much for this opportunity. I really appreciate it, and yeah, thank you very, very much for all the audience that have been listening and watching, and yeah, very appreciate it.
Yeah, and you talked about, thank you very much. And you talked about brand equity, which we could go into a whole separate session on brand equity. Brand equity is actually the equity, the value that you have in the minds of your current customers, in your prospects, and so investments that you've made for years and years and years. And so sometimes people will say, well, I need to freshen up the brand. And by inviting in new people, you abandon a lot of the old people. And I think a perfect example of that was one of the greatest advertising mistakes of all time. We've already talked about them, was when Coca-Cola decided they needed to do New Coke. And that created such an uproar. And that was a response to a very successful Pepsi-Cola campaign in the 80s. And it was one of the great mistakes because they had so much equity in this happiness, in the consistency of the flavor. And so changing your brand isn't always the best things, but you can always freshen it up. All right. Well, Alejandro, thank you so much for joining me. This has been another phenomenal session of Marketing Cafe Live talking about branding. And we will definitely see Alejandro again, as there are so many different aspects of branding that we can discuss. Remember, you can go to marketingcafe.club to get all of the recordings of these Marketing Cafe Live. We're so glad that you joined us, and we will see you next time here in the Marketing Cafe.